How can we approximate this problem with less fidelity? Results don't look as good, results don't feel as good, but maintain the time budget. This is the part where developers probably start looking at this and are like, well, efficiency is great, but scalability means you're affecting my content. And that's kind of the whole point. This means that your game might not look as good as it would have otherwise looked on some devices, but it will run reasonably performantly, right? And so this is important for us because this is our strategy of making sure that the content runs on many different devices without you guys having to adapt this content for these different devices in a special way. And then generality is one final pillar. We always need or want to do way more things that we have time and resources for. And so whenever we think about solving problems, we usually start with a solution that's general enough to solve a bunch of different problems just as a byproduct. And then sometimes we do need to change that solution over time, and we will talk about some of the examples, but the more general the solution is for us, generally speaking, the better. And so this is kind of what this means, is that there's a platform, which is Roblox, and there is developers, which is you guys, right? And we have different priorities. And it's important to understand these different priorities from both sides, really, and how to adapt to that. Because if you're a developer, you only care about your game, which makes sense, you should. And to make your game perfect or as good as you can make it, you want a lot of controls over all of the different aspects of behavior of the engine, and you want a lot of customization abilities. As a platform, though, we can't care about your game. We need to care about all of the games on the platform. We need to care about breadth, right, and depth to some extent, but we can't sacrifice depth, right? And also we need to think about this evolution that I was talking about, right? Roblox is a live platform. So we developed this over more than a decade now, and we will continue to develop this over more than a decade, I'm sure. So we need to think about APIs and implementations from the longevity perspective, and we need to think about how to serve millions of games with a small set of implementations, small set of APIs comparatively, right? And so it's important to understand this when thinking about the Roblox engine development in general. Now, we talked about the general high-level principles. Let's dive a bit into the details, like how do these translate into the actual implementation? And one simple way to talk about this is to talk about a very specific example of one very simple API where you have a part and you can change the part C-frame to some other C-frame, right? It's very simple. I'm sure all of you guys have done this at one point or another. And it's just one line of Lua code. How complex can it be? Now, we don't actually have enough time today to talk about every single system that is involved in implementing this. So we'll have to cover a few of those. And the systems that we'll talk about are these. We'll cover them in order because this order roughly corresponds to kind of the order of the way things happen in the engine after you do or when you do the part C-frame assignment. The abstract of the talk promised to talk about voxels in context of terrain, and we will not be doing that. Sorry. So let's talk about the steps that happen here. The first is reflection, which is sort of a general abstract system. And then there is two systems that are part of the physics engine, which is spanning tree and broad face. And there's two systems that are part of the rendering engine. And we'll talk a bit about how they work and how they evolved over time. So let's start with reflection. Now, people who know Lua on a relatively deep level know that when you do a part C-frame assignment, it's not really changing the property of the part from the Lua perspective. It's calling a new index method. And when this method is called, this goes directly into our C++ code. And we receive the call when we get the object, which is the part here, right? The property, which is a name of the property C-frame here. This is a string, right? And then we get the value, which is a C-frame object. Now, reflection for us from the Lua perspective is broken into two parts. It's a general system that powers all of the APIs. And the way this works is first, there's a Lua component to that, which is getting data from Lua into C++. So it's looking at the string and asking, okay, what's the C++ kind of string representation of C++ is the language that our engine is written in. It's like a low-level systemd language that's compiled. So then it's looking at the value, which is the C frame, and kind of extracting the engine object here. But then there's a lot of other things that this low portion has to do. So for example, the property is a string, and so it has to somehow map the string to the actual property descriptor, which is an object that represents what you can do with this property. But once you have done this, you also need to ask, for example, does the caller even have access to this property? Because there are some properties that cannot be set, and there are some properties that can be read or written to, but they cannot be used by a regular script. They require a core script or something like this, right? So there's some amount of code here that deals with, okay, can the caller do this? And if they can, what do they actually mean by that? So after this, though, we get squarely into the C++ domain, and there's still one more reflection system there, which for people who were on the platform way back when, this was written by Eric Castle, and actually a lot of the structure of the system is still intact from the good old days. So fundamentally, if you think about Roblox, there's a lot of different objects that we expose to you guys, and there's a lot of different properties and methods and events and all of that. It's like a lot of code, and it would be very fragile if every time you had to add a property, for example, you would have to think, okay, now I need to implement XML support for this property because you can save and load data from XML. I need to implement network replication because, of course, when you change something on the server, it has to go back to the client, et cetera, right? So this is not what we do. Instead, we have this general system that can translate between the dynamic concepts, meaning there's a string that says there's a property, right? C frame, like what do you do with that? And the static concept, which is, okay, when there is a part object, there's an actual block of bytes in memory on the C++ engine side where the C frame is stored, right? And so this translation is important, and we use this reflection system in many different systems. It's used for serialization, Lua, replication. It's used for property grid. So similarly, when you add a property, you don't have to think about how does a user edit it in Studio. It just appears. And there's a lot of other uses here as well. So this is an example of a system that's completely general, and it has to be general to support all of these different use cases. And then it's not really, scalability doesn't really apply here, but it's as efficient as we could make it within the constraints. And we actually had to iterate a lot on the performance here over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, including some large performance improvements that happened around last year, like end of last year. All right, so once we're out of the reflection system, though, now we are completely within the engine. The engine knows exactly what to do. Here's a part, here's a C frame, set it. And I said there's a block of bytes in the part, so maybe you just copy the values there, but that's not as simple. That's not how it works. So the first thing we have to talk about is the spanning tree, where there's not actually quite a block of bytes that represents each C frame of a part in memory. So this implementation leaks a bit through the API, so some of you may be familiar with this. But fundamentally, when you think about Roblox parts, it is not the case that every part is stored and is behaving in isolation. So on the left here, it's an example of a character, which is somewhere between R6 and R15. The character has a few limbs, and it has a head, which is welded to the head. So in physics engine, we represent this as a graph, and there's a tree that kind of is the core representation of this graph. Spanning tree is an actual concept from graph theory. This tree stores parts as the vertices of the tree, and nodes are the edges that connect these parts. So you can see here there's torso, which connects to the head, left arm, and right arm, and then the head and the head are connected with the weld, for example, right? There's a few types of connections here, and these types of connections determine the logical units of grouping further. So when you have a set of parts that are connected only with welds, this is called a clump. This is important because when you have a set of parts that are connected with a bunch of welds, we know all of these parts can only move in tandem, right? Physics engine cannot kind of split them apart unless you break the weld with the script. And then if you have a few clumps that are connected together with what we call kinematic joints, motors, these are joints that can be animated, but that aren't usually physically simulated. The result forms an assembly. And then the physics engine actually mostly has to deal with assemblies when it comes to the solver, because you only can, for example, when the character tumbles, the character's rigid body that stores momentum, etc., is just the entire character. Now, there's like sort of higher level structures that we will not talk about here, but there's this tree, right? And this tree is formed automatically whenever you create or delete joins between parts. And there are some rules to how the tree is constructed, which we won't go too much into because I really don't want you guys to kind of go away from this talk and be like, okay, awesome, let me apply all of this hidden knowledge that Arsene just told me about to my game, because there's no actual promise that this will hold exactly over time, but there's some heuristics around, which parts should be closer to the top of the tree and which parts should be closer to the bottom of the tree. There's some ordering, and some of this you actually can control. There is some APIs on the part. I think we allow you to do massless parts now, and you can set priority of the part. So there's some degree of control that you have over the construction of this tree. Now, why is all of this important? So there's two important problems, or there's two important reasons why this structure exists. So one is the transforms in the structure are actually stored relative to the parent, which means that if you have a character and the root of the character from the tree perspective is the humanoid root part, when you move the humanoid root part, internally we actually can optimize a lot of the kind of transform method has to happen, because we don't have to move necessarily the parts downstream, we have to move the root. And then the transforms of all of the other parts can be inferred. The other really crucial problem, though, is welds. So in Roblox, as you're well aware, it's typical to build these large complex constructions out of a lot of the parts that are all welded together. So if you think of a car, it's completely natural to have a car that's like 100 parts welded, right? It's really important that the physics engine can not care about all of these individual parts when, for example, doing the physics solve. So because of this, the physics engine mostly cares about the assemblies, and then the collision engine does have to care about the individual parts, although we are actually working on making that better now. And so this is a big structure that is used for performance optimizations around around structures with many welds, or in general around characters and assemblies that consist of animated joints. All right, so I said that you only really need to move the root. That's not quite true. Let's talk about the broad face now. So every part has a C-frame, and it also has a size. So in theory, when you ask every part where it is, you know the answer. But there is often cases where you need to ask the opposite question. Given this region of space, what parts are there? This is really important for raycasts, of course. This is also important for context. When the part moves, we need to update the contact collision information between that part and everything that's in the new space occupied by this part, right? So it's really important to be able to do this inverse query. And to do this inverse query, we have a broad face structure. And the broad face structure is implemented as a spatial hash. So this is, if you are really technically inclined, you can actually Google, there's a paper, spatial hash based implementation of collision detection in 3D space or something like that, which is actually what inspired this original implementation. This was written by Dave, the Builderman himself, many years ago, but we have substantially optimized this since. Now, the way this works is that whenever there is a part, so the entire space is broken into these cells. You can think of cells as voxels because there are cubes, but they are multi-resolution. So there are small cells, the minimum size is 8 studs, and there are large cells up to 512 studs. Every part lives in a certain set of cells. And so for every part, you can ask what cells are you in? And for every cell, you can ask what parts are in you. And there's other details that I won't actually go into in the interest of time. But and also for each part, based on the size of the part, we actually pick the cell size that the part should be in. And so when the part moves, what has to happen is we have to update the the cell information. So we have to tell the cells that the part intersects in the new location about the fact that it is there. And so then we can implement a lot of spatial queries around this, and raycasts and collision kind of manipulation, all of that stuff. Now, why did we choose kind of this specific construction? Because there's a lot of other types of broad faces that are interesting. So there's a core hypothesis in Roblox that a lot of parts move. And because of this, we need updates to the part position to be fast. And particularly the use cases, you have small parts, right? So for small parts, the updates here are very fast because usually a small part just lives in one cell and maybe it moves to another cell and we just need to update a few pointers. Then there's a lot of systems that need to be able to ask these questions around spatial positioning of parts. And this is a single implementation that satisfies a lot of these use cases. So it can solve raycast, and it can solve collision detection, and it can solve spatial queries. Because of this, there's a lot of other systems in the engine that use this. So a lot of physics components, of course, but also, for example, the streaming system, which is a network component, right? It uses this system to be able to say, okay, so the player moved somewhere. We need to send this player a region of instances, right, of parts. What parts should be in this region? Okay, the system directly answers this question. It's also the case that lighting used to use the system for voxelization. It doesn't do this anymore, but and there are systems that are not mentioned on the slide that also do, such as pathfinding. And also, there's no assumptions in the system about the world size of the world density. You can place a few parts a million studs apart, and the system will handle them. You can place a lot of parts pretty densely, and it can handle them that really well as well. We don't ask you, right, to set up the maximum world size, etc., which you actually have to do in some physics engines that are not ours. Now, what are the problems with the system? So there's one problem which still is true to an extent, although we made it better, which is if you have a very large part, if you're moving a very large part, it may get expensive, especially if your part is actually long but thin, because remember, the system is based on cubes. So if you have a long but thin parts, we either can pick a really large cube that it should be in, or a lot of really small cubes, and neither of these choices are optimal. But also, one big thing about the system is, okay, so a lot of systems use that. And because of this, you can't actually stop updating this, because something in the engine will break when you do so. So people ask us a lot about, no physics parts. And there are some optimizations that we can make around them, but fundamentally, it's wrong to think that you can update the part and update the part C-frame, and that update can be just instantaneous because it only has to write the C-frame into the part. You do need tracking structures like this one, and you can't really opt out of updating them. All right, so we covered most of the, we covered physics information that was in this talk. There is a lot more physics systems that may need to react to C-frame movements, but actually if your part is anchored and let's say can collide faults, then this is a close approximation of what has to happen in our system to support your C-frame change. Let's talk about now rendering. So there's also networking updates that may have to happen. There's also pathfinding updates that may have to happen. We just don't have time for this. Ask me questions later. So when we talk about rendering, again, you may think about our system as, okay, I have a level. The level has 10,000 parts. Roblox just renders them one by one. Well, this is not true. This hasn't been true since the year after I joined, I guess, Roblox, which was 2012. Just because it's inefficient. So the graphics hardware that powers the games that exist in every single device that Roblox runs on is efficient, generally speaking, at processing many triangles, but you have to submit these triangles in relatively large groups. So because of this, we don't actually render parts one by one. We group them into these, what we call clusters, which are just spatially proximal collections of parts. And this grouping is automatic. There's two implementations here, and now we we get a chance to talk a bit about the evolution. So the first implementation is the one that we shipped in, I think, end of 2012 or beginning 2013, which is called Featherweight Parts. And the way this works is when you have a cluster with 100 parts in it, we actually create a mesh that comprises of all of the triangles of these parts. And we create this mesh dynamically because when you change a part's color, for example, we actually have to bake the color of the part into the vertices of that mesh. This system performs amazingly well when nothing changes in your world. And this was actually the case in 2013. There were a lot of games with thousands of parts, nothing changes. Okay, cool. Crossroads works roughly like this. It's great for that. Now, whenever you actually have to change something, we don't support incremental updates because it's really hard to kind of pull out vertices from some parts of the mesh, and then you can't actually upload partially, like this information partially to the GPU. So we just rebuilt the entire cluster from scratch. This code is reasonably fast. It's like efficient, but it doesn't scale very well. And there are some exceptions around this. The part C-frame updates are actually faster than you might expect in some cases. But in some cases, when you have an anchored part that you haven't moved in a while and then you C-frame it someplace, it actually triggers an expensive update. So because of this, we try to not use the system anymore. Because of this, we had to make a new system, which is called instancing. And there's a dev forum post with more details about how this works. But this uses some newer functionality or some functionality on the newer GPUs to implement the same kind of concept when you have a cluster comprised of many parts and you want to render the cluster in as few kind of transfers to the GPU as possible, but it implements it very differently, where it doesn't actually have to merge the triangles of different parts together. It just has to have a meta information, like where is each part, what size is the part, etc., etc. And then a lot of work here is done in the shaders on the GPU. This system is great. It has really fast updates for basically most properties. However, it requires hardware to support the system. And also, it's not actually compatible with every single feature that we have. For example, the skinning that we just almost shipped, doesn't actually work with this yet. And the humanoids in general don't work with the system for complicated reasons. And so this is where, we started with a single system that's fully general and can support all of the use cases that we care about, but we can't actually use just that system. So now we have the second system, which is this one, and it's likely that we'll need the third system to deal with some other complex, intricacies. But maybe at some point we get to remove the original system when the hardware catches up and we can actually use kind of more modern implementation approaches on every single device that Roblox runs on. All right, so this is, 5-minute overview of rendering at Roblox. Let's do a 5-minute overview of lighting at Roblox, which again is the case where, we started with just one system that can handle everything, but we are forced to continuously evolve that system and implement new ones that supplant portions of that. So as all of you know, hopefully there's like lighting technology options now, and there's a voxel one, there's compatibility, which is not important, there's the voxel one, and there's a shadow map, and there's this new futurist bright phase 3 thing. And these, broadly speaking, represent 3 different lighting systems. We will not actually talk about the shadow maps or futurist bright 3. Again, just don't have a lot of time to do this, but we will talk a bit about the voxel implementation, which is what we started with. So, some people may not realize, but actually the voxel system, some parts of the voxel system, I should say, are used in all modes. So even when you switch to shadow map, or even when you switch to futurist bright phase 3, we have to use voxels for some portions of the lighting of the rendering equation. And I will briefly cover this. I'll briefly cover why, but let's first discuss how the voxel lighting system works. So the first thing that the voxel lighting system does, it actually creates the voxels out of the scene. So we split the world into chunks, and the chunk contains a fixed amount of voxels. Voxels are fixed size, as you know, 4x4 voxels. Whenever you move a part, we have to find the chunk that the part is in and say, okay, we need to revoxelize this chunk. And this just means going over parts in this chunk and then going over voxels that each part occupies, and then doing some complex math that I will not go into to produce a few values per voxel. We use occupancy. People who work with terrain kind of know what occupancy means, but in context of voxel lighting, it's a bit more complex because there's actually 3 different occupancy values per voxel. But there's some code here that is really intricate that goes from parts to voxels. The beauty of the system is that after this, it doesn't matter where parts are. Like, parts are just completely ignored. So after we have this voxel field, what we can do, for example, is we can compute light and shadow information. And the way we do this is we look at lights and we look at voxels, and we say, okay, to compute shadow in this voxel, we need to look at lights, and then we need to trace the conceptual implementation is we need to trace rays from the light sources to that voxel. And then if the ray hits one of the voxels along the path that is occupied by a part that has occupancy, right, then the voxel is in shadow. Like, the real implementation does not use raycast. It's much more, again, complex and efficient, but conceptually this is similar. And then we can also, for each voxel, compute the light influence once we know if the voxel is in shadow or not, by computing distances to light sources and then doing various kind of color calculations, etc. Now, why do we even use the voxel lighting system? So there are some components of the rendering equation that can be computed without the use of voxels, which is what we do with shadow maps now, right? And this is what we do with futurist bright phase 3. However, even in Future's Bright Phase 3, there are some things that just cannot be computed well with voxels, without voxels. One thing we do, which not a lot of people are aware of, is that we compute the Skylight term, which is global illumination from the sky onto the scene. It's approximate, it's voxel-based, voxel for large, etc., but it actually is really hard to compute the same term without using voxels, and without this term, the levels look much more flat. Also, the system is great because it allows us to decouple the complexity, decouple the cost of updates along many axes. So when you move a part, we do have to revoxelize the chunk, but it doesn't actually matter after this how many parts you have, because we computed the voxel representation. After this, we just work with that. And then when you look at light sources, if you place a lot of light sources in your level, it does increase the cost of the update of the voxel data of this chunk. But for example, it doesn't matter if you're running the game in 1080p or 360p or 4K, the cost of subsequent passes that happen on the GPU are the same, which is not true of Future's Bright Phase 3, by the way. And also, this system runs on every single device. Like, it doesn't matter, how old of a potato you have, it will run there. Unfortunately, as we discovered, of course, as you all know, it's hard to scale the quality of the system. So we can improve the quality of the voxel lighting system. However, when you make voxels smaller, the time and memory cost scales as a cube of the voxel size. And so it's actually really hard for us to make the system super high quality, just because it will not because we can do this, but because it will not run efficiently enough. And because of this, we are implementing all of these new systems that can scale quality better in some parts of the system. The other nice thing, though, here is that it's easy to say, well, I don't need to update these voxels now. I will update them at some point later in the frame, which causes slight lag, which is, I think, what people refer to in Roblox, but it helps maintain stable frame rate. All right, so this is a brief, quick overview of a few engine systems that you actually have to go through when you think about, okay, what happens when I change a C-frame? There's a lot more complexity here, as I mentioned, in some other systems in the engine. We don't have time for this, but I want to leave you with this. So when you develop content on Roblox, usually what you see is this top of the iceberg where there's an API. And even there's some intricacies that we discussed at the very beginning about, can this API live for 5 years without us having to deprecate it? And what it usually boils down to is APIs should specify intent, what you're trying to do, not implementation, not how you're trying to do. But then if you look, underwater, there's a lot of iceberg there. And there's a lot of problems that we have to solve around memory and performance, and how do you evolve all of this without breaking content, etc. A lot of the work that we do ends up, iterating on existing implementations, experimenting with new implementations, which is, again, what Future's Bright project was about up until we started actually shipping that, right? We usually start with one single general system that can just support all the use cases, but then over time, some branches of the system become more specialized to some specific problems, or sometimes we have to make new systems to, again, implement some of the kind of intricate, sometimes to implement features that the old system couldn't do, but often just to improve the quality of performance of the system. And it's really, really crucial to be able to combine all of these systems together and kind of get the best parts of each system and then combine them under a single API. And then usually this gives us really good results. And so it's very easy to just not think about all of this complexity. And so I want to leave you guys with this. So when you think about the APIs, when you think about, okay, why does Roblox not do that? Or my game would have been so much better if this was a thing. Think about two aspects, right? One is there's just one game that you're working on, but there's so many different games, and we have to prioritize. We have to figure out, okay, what's the actual common cases that we have to focus on versus cases that are really cool but uncommon. And when you are proposing an API, think about, longevity. What will happen to this in 5 years is the big question. And then if you're if you're a scripter, if you are curious about, internal implementation details, it's very valuable to go through this thought experiment of, okay, if I were to implement this feature, or if I were to rebuild a Roblox system to make it better in some way, how would I do this? what would the implementation strategy be? How would it be? How would it support the efficiency and scalability goals? And am I painting myself into a corner by building this now, by blocking further progress in some axes that might be important? So with that, I want to thank you guys for attending the presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions for whatever time we have left.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Arseny, for that insightful presentation. I think I'm finally starting to understand how C-frames work. All right, let's see what questions our developers have. But first of all, I think I saw that everyone wants to know, when will Roblox release the Arseny font?
Okay, Arsene font?
Yeah, the one you used on your presentation.
Okay. We can talk about this. I think we are actually planning some font enhancements. This was covered in RDC, so we'll talk internally about shipping an RC font. I think it makes sense.
Awesome. All right, we only have a few questions, or a few minutes for questions, so I'm going to go as quick as I can. The ones we don't get to, we'll try and answer on Discord. So the first one is from Colbert2677. Is there any possibility of increasing the tick rate on servers?
Yeah, so right now we are trying to go into not a different direction, but a direction of kind of increasing the density of content on the servers and trying to maintain acceptable tick rate. We are, depending on the tick rate that you are talking though, we are talking about increasing some internal ticks that are under 60 Hertz, but it's unlikely that we'll go 120 Hertz on the server in the foreseeable future just because we want to scale the content first.
Got it. If Phil New Seat today asks, why not a font API service?
Font API service. I don't know. It's complicated. We actually talked, like if you're talking about the user customizable fonts, we looked into this. There's complexity there. There's a lot of subtlety in licensing in fonts. And also we are trying to provide a platform that supports basically every single language under the sun. And it's actually really hard to find even languages that, fonts and typefaces that support even the European extensions to ASCII, and like Cyrillic is really tough. The fonts that we ship, they mostly try to support a reasonable subset. And so all of these become a bit challenging when you talk about just, okay, developers can upload their own fonts. But this is not off the table. It might happen.
Got it. Louis K22 asks, how do you balance providing low-level controls to developers with designing APIs that also need to be accessible?
Yeah, so this is really hard. Like we try to not provide low-level controls at all if possible. The way we usually think about this is maybe there's a way that we can provide the API where right now there's a direct mapping maybe between some of the options in the API and the internal implementation details. But if we think about the future, we could tell you, well, instead of this option doing that, it now does something else internally, but conceptually it's still close. Like if you think about the shadow softness property, for example, it broadly speaking tells you how soft your shadows are, like how diffuse your shadows are, but we actually don't promise you that like 0.5 means any specific thing. And so we could change it in the future.
Great. And this is going to be our last question that we'll be able to answer live. We'll follow up with the additional questions that we have here on Discord. Cool Kid Tris asks, will Roblox ever support AO, Edge, or any other texture maps?
So AO, yes, we actually are talking about this. I don't know when, but it will probably happen at some point as part of surface appearance evolution. Everything else is complicated. We are trying to find this balance between, again, what's the most common use cases that developers have, what features will benefit the largest population of games, etc. So not sure about edge maps, but IO will likely happen.
Awesome. So we have a bit of a break now, and there are a ton of great activities that you can hop into before our next talk. But before we go and do that and get into some announcements, I just want to say thank you again, Arseny. This was so insightful. Everyone in chat seemed to love it. They have a ton of questions, so let's follow up once we go offline and we can hop into Discord and answer some of the questions that we had left over.
I'll be on Discord for a bit after this to answer questions in the correct. Please don't ask me questions in the general channel because it's...
Yeah. We'll sync up. So just a quick thing, we got the networking room open. If you want to go and meet some new developers, we have an instructor leading short body movement series. If you want to, take a little stretch break, Silas Studio, Red Manta, and Team Adopt Me are at their booths waiting to talk to you. We have a Q&A session with Dr. Rich on how to better take care of your mental health. And don't forget to go and snap a photo at our virtual photo booth to be forever immortalized in the RDC 2020 mural. Just make sure you're back by 11:50 a.m. Pacific for our next talk. Look for a link to join an RBX Team Up Studio Discord channel. Thank you again, and we'll see you at 11:50.